Stop me if you've ever heard this before. Jiraiya could win with info. Now, to a lot of you, what I'm referring to here seems rather obvious. I'm telling you that in Jiraiya's fated battle against the Six Paths of Pain, that if he understood the abilities of the Six Paths of Pain heading into that fight, he would have came out victorious. That if Jiraiya knew that none of the Paths of Pain were Nagato, and rather that they were 6 corpses pilotly controlled by Nagato, who was miles away, who were all either shinobi that Jiraiya had fought against in the past, or, Yahiko, who shared all of their senses through their Rinnegan, and each controlled one individual ability of these 6 paths, that Jiraiya, with that information, would have had a big enough leg up in the battle that he would have came out victorious. But is that true? I mean, yeah, it gets said all the time, but is it true? And well, unfortunately, there's really no way to know. There is pretty concrete ways to come to an answer. And that is exactly what we're gonna be doing today. See, because today, we're gonna be poring over Jiraiya's fight against the Six Paths of Pain, where he went wrong, what he would have done differently if he had information, and more importantly, what the conclusion would have been if he had said information. And once and for all, we're going to answer the question, could Jiraiya have won with info? Because today we're talking Jiraiya could have beaten Pain. But before we get to talking on any crazy hypotheticals, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you're looking for one additional NC Hammer 23 video a week, I have restarted my Naruto reaction series, and you can find it using the 4th wall link in the description below. So, quite possibly one of the most posed questions in the Naruto community, mostly based off the fact that nobody wanted to see Jiraiya die. Could Jiraiya win with info? Well, in order to answer that question, we kind of have to go over, rather meticulously, how Jiraiya lost without info, and how said lack of info led to his defeat. And thus, before we get speculating on as to whether or not Jiraiya would be able to win if he knew everything there was to know about the Six Paths of Pain and Nagato's newfound ability, we do have to rather painstakingly go over the fight that we do have from Jiraiya and the Six Paths of Pain. And not just from the fight itself, but everything leading up to the fight. See, because it's important for us to understand exactly how much information Jiraiya did have going into this battle in the first place. Because if he did have some idea of what he was heading into with this battle against the Six Paths of Pain, then saying that he lost because he didn't have info isn't really all that accurate. So our analysis of this battle between Jiraiya, Nagato, and Konan is actually going to begin with Jiraiya's infiltration of the Hidden Rain Village. See, this fated battle starts from the very moment that Jiraiya climbs out of a toad into the Hidden Rain Village, after which he immediately remarks about how easy it was to sneak into the Hidden Rain Village. However, sneak isn't necessarily the best descriptive word in this scenario, as the second that Jiraiya climbs out of the toad into the Hidden Rain Village, he is found out, as the Devapath, who's been controlling all of the rain falling down on the Hidden Rain Village, notices that his rain is hitting a new chakra signature, and a strong one at that. Now, because of this, the Devapath and Konan are immediately onto the fact that somebody has snuck into the Hidden Rain, and thus the deck is already stacked against Jiraiya. But they don't necessarily know where he is, which gives Jiraiya a couple of minutes, if not a couple of hours, to do some reconnaissance. Reconnaissance that allows for him to abduct 2 Hidden Rain shinobi, who are, ironically, trying to get out of the rain, which is pretty insane when you consider the fact that they live in the Hidden Rain Village. I can't imagine it stops raining all that often. But anyways, Jiraiya pulls these 2 Hidden Rain shinobi down into his toad stomach, where he begins to interrogate them. And through his interrogation, he learns that Pain is supposedly living in the western tallest tower in the village. However, when Jiraiya continues to push the shinobi trying to figure out what Pain's abilities are, the shinobi claims to not know anything, which is probably accurate because Pain very purposely kept all of his abilities on the DL. Now, while Jiraiya is conducting his tickle-based interrogation, the Devapath ironically stops the rain and has Konan send out paper butterflies to act as reconnaissance. And thus immediately when Jiraiya climbs out of his toad stomach to restart his investigation into Pain in the Hidden Rain Village, Konan appears in front of him. And thus Konan, who's now seen that it's Jiraiya who has infiltrated the Hidden Rain Village, relays that back to Nagato. And thus once again Jiraiya is in a disadvantageous situation, as Nagato has a much better understanding of what Jiraiya's abilities are than Jiraiya has of what Nagato's abilities are. But it's not as necessarily one-sided as many would have you believe, as Nagato displays over the course of their battle to not actually know that Jiraiya had the ability to undergo a Toad Sage transformation, which is why when Jiraiya shows up with Ma and Pa on his shoulders with his imperfect Toad Sage mode, the Animal Path, which is currently operating as Nagato at that certain point of the fight, at least in Jiraiya's mind is operating as Nagato, is blown away and slightly confused by the emergence of Toad Sage Jiraiya. Now, after relaying the information of Jiraiya's invasion back to Nagato, Konan immediately attacks him, at which point Jiraiya makes objectively the right decision and counters her Dance of the Shinigami paper-based attack with a Toad Bomb, aka his fire release that he shoots out of his mouth. And immediately after this, Jiraiya deduces the fact that Konan has made her entire body out of paper, something that he's rather impressed by. And he continues to use his flame release to counteract her attacks, but also uses his Toad Oil to hit her with, globbing up her entire body, making sure that she can't separate into pieces of paper. He then uses his Maybe It's Maybelline attack and grabs her with his hair, and thus in this moment, Konan is rather utterly defeated, as Jiraiya not only has a hard counter to all of her offensive capability,
but also eliminated her ability to separate and then apprehended her.
And thus, up until this moment, one could argue that Jiraiya has operated completely perfectly. Information or no, Jiraiya has made correct decision after correct decision. However, unfortunately for Jiraiya, this is when the animal path shows up. Now, in the circumstance where Jiraiya knows everything that he needs to know heading into this battle, Jiraiya doesn't mistake the animal path for Nagato like he does in the main timeline. And rather, Jiraiya knows that this is the animal path, one of the 6 paths of pain, and the lowest priority path of pain, mind you. The path of pain that Nagato always sends out first, and the path of pain that Nagato uses kind of as a sacrificial pawn. On top of that, Jiraiya would understand that the animal path only has the ability to use summoning jutsus, and those summoning jutsus seem to be somewhat endless, so fighting against them is pointless. But that doesn't mean that Jiraiya, with all of his info, wouldn't be forced into fighting against these summons, because as soon as the animal path arrives, it summons a giant crab that not only attacks Jiraiya, but also cleanses Konan of all of the Toad Oil. But Jiraiya makes the objectively correct decision when the animal path shows up with its giant crab, and he doesn't attack the summoning, but rather the summoner, as he immediately ducks the attack of the giant crab and grabs the animal path with his hair like he did to Konan. Now, one can make the argument that right here, Jiraiya had the opportunity to destroy the animal path, and he probably should have, except he believed that it was Nagato, except that's not the case, because the animal path wasn't actually caught up in Jiraiya's hair. It was a substitution. So even though Jiraiya did technically make the right decision of attacking the summoner and not the summoning, something he would have done if he had had information about how the animal path's abilities worked, it didn't pan out for him. And immediately after this, the animal path goes invisible by allowing for his chameleon summoning to swallow him whole. Now, mind you, at this moment in time, Jiraiya has realized that he's gonna have to use his Sage Mode. However, Jiraiya's Sage Mode isn't all that effective, considering the fact that he's really bad at pulling in Senjutsu Chakra, so he needs to be able to summon Ma and Pa. But summoning Ma and Pa and entering his Sage Mode takes way more time than it takes for Naruto. And unfortunately, kind of like Hashirama using his wood release and maintaining his Sage Mode, it requires that his hands stay together. Now, this is where Jiraiya begins to make mistakes. See, because if Jiraiya understood in this moment that the animal path is only one of 6 paths of pain that are lurking in the hidden raid waiting for him, the logical and sensible thing to do here would be to retreat long enough to allow yourself to summon Ma and Pa and enter Sage Mode. And whether you do that by running away in the hidden rain village or simply going into the Toad's stomach, aka Jiraiya's barrier, either option is inherently more sensible than what Jiraiya did, but not by all that much. See, because instead of retreating immediately upon realizing that the animal path had gone invisible, Jiraiya summons Gamaken and uses a barrier jutsu that allows for him to detect the chakra signature of anything that crosses into said barrier, kind of like N in Hunter x Hunter. And the animal path, upon realizing that he can't sneak up on Jiraiya anymore, simply instead decides to summon his 3-headed dog. And the 3-headed dog barrels at Jiraiya as he stands on top of Gamaken. Now, logic here would tell you that if Jiraiya understood the abilities of the 3-headed dog and its ability to infinitely replicate if it's ever injured, you would say, oh, well, Jiraiya would just avoid the 3-headed dog and run away. And, well, yeah, that would have been the optimal course of action. 1, it's not Jiraiya who attacks the 3-headed dog first, that's Gamaken. And 2, running away wasn't necessarily an option. The 3-headed dog appeared out of nowhere and Gamaken pinned it to a wall as a reactionary response. Now, unfortunately for Jiraiya and Gamaken, the 3-headed dog doesn't stay pinned to the wall all that long, as it splits up into a bunch of individual dogs that continue to pursue Jiraiya. And for a little while, this revelation makes it seem as though Jiraiya's really against the ropes. However, Jiraiya uses a series of shadow clones of both himself and Gamaken to slowly but surely lead all of the dogs into one isolated area where he leads them into a Toad stomach trap, which allows for him to rather easily, mind you, get rid of the animal summoning's most annoying summoning, as now that all of the dogs are trapped inside of the Toad stomach, it doesn't matter if they replicate infinitely because they're locked in a barrier they can't escape from. And this is objectively kind of the perfect plan. All while trying to summon Ma and Pa and enter his Sage Mode, Jiraiya was able to not only battle back against the animal path, but also eliminate its most dangerous weapon. Now, after it's revealed that the Jiraiya that pulled all the dogs into the Toad stomach was simply a shadow clone, Jiraiya believes that he finds the animal path hidden inside of an invisible lizard and attacks, but realizes in that moment that that invisible lizard and that animal path were also shadow clones. And thus he leaves himself open to the attack of the giant bird summoning, which causes Gamaken to take some damage. Now, at this point, Jiraiya begins to wonder as to why Nagato, who he believes is the animal path, is only using the summoning jutsu. Something he obviously wouldn't have had to wonder if he had access to all possible information. And while one could absolutely try and make the argument here that if Jiraiya had access to all of the possible information he could ever have on the six paths of pain, that it wouldn't have wasted his time on the animal path, as the animal path is the lowest priority of all of the paths. And even if he did take out the animal path, there was a fair decent chance that after he took out the animal path, the Naraka path could simply revive it. It's not like Jiraiya is necessarily not pushed up against the ropes by simply just the animal path. And I know there's a lot of people out there who are saying, oh, well, Jiraiya should have just gone and tried to find Nagato. But it bears mentioning that Jiraiya is not only not as good a sage as Naruto, but also not as good a sensor ninja as Naruto. Yes, obviously, Naruto was able to find Nagato's true body, but only after all of the other paths of pain had been eliminated. Do you know how insanely difficult it would be to try and find Nagato's true body while also having to fight against the six paths of pain? Even if hypothetically Jiraiya could triangulate Nagato's body, the paths of pain would just simply defend it. Not to mention Konan is still very much in the mix. Anyways, after taking some damage from the animal path, Jiraiya is finally afforded enough time to summon Ma and Pa and enter his imperfect sage mode. At which point Ma uses her creature detection ability that allows for her to shoot out her tongue at apparently a speed so great that the animal path can't react to it, and find the invisible lizard. And once she wraps up said invisible lizard, Pa is able to fire a jet stream of water out of his mouth that slices the lizard in half, getting rid of the invisible chameleon, it's not a lizard, and revealing the animal path. However, the animal path, who was at this point kind of cornered, then decides to summon the human and Preda paths. Now, the human path isn't really a threat in this fight, as the human path's only real ability is reading people's souls by yanking them out of the top of their heads, and thus the human path more acts as a reconnaissance measure than an offensive measure. But the Preda path is absolutely a threat, and kind of the real big turning point for Jiraiya, as the Preda path has the ability to absorb ninjutsu, and thus upon seeing the Preda path, Jiraiya, if he had information, would have known that ninjutsu is off the table, and thus wouldn't have wasted the time, effort, or chakra to try and hit really any of the paths with ninjutsu so long as the Preda path was around. And for a second, he does kind of abide by this code, because as the human path flies towards Jiraiya, he simply kicks it in the eyes about as hard as he physically can, blinding it. However, in order to push the offensive against the Preda and animal paths, Jiraiya decides to use his sage art Goemon, or his boiling toad oil bath, where him, Ma, and Pa use a combination of toad oil, fire release, and wind release to cover the entire room in flaming toad oil. Flaming toad oil that not only undoubtedly took a lot of chakra to create, but flaming toad oil that the Preda path pretty much immediately absorbs. Now, rather obviously to us, because we understand the magnitude of the situation, the correct move in this battle against this iteration of the Paths of Pain would have either been the Toad Confrontation chant or the Toad Stomach Sealing Barrier jutsu, as those are two jutsus that can't be absorbed by the Preda path's absorption ability. However, he does get there eventually. But unfortunately, before he is able to use his Toad Confrontation chant against these three paths, Jiraiya tries to use a massive, and I mean massive, Rasengan against the Preda path or the animal path, which the Preda path immediately absorbs. And thus Jiraiya has used two incredibly chakra depletive moves against the Preda path. But that's really not the end of the world. See, over the course of this battle, Jiraiya never once says that he's running out of chakra. One, Jiraiya's chakra pool is massive, and two, he's in sage mode for the majority of it. And Ma and Pa are not only constantly pulling in nature energy, but turning it into senjutsu energy and pumping it into his body. Jiraiya's not doing any of the chakra collecting work. And so while a lot of people will say that Jiraiya having these two jutsus absorbed was something that doomed him down the line, I don't think that's necessarily true. He doesn't seem out of breath, he doesn't seem out of chakra, he's not talking about how he's at his limit, and while he wouldn't have done either of these things if he knew that the Preda path had the ability to absorb ninjutsu, this doesn't necessarily set him back in any feasible way. Now, in the recovery from the Preda path absorbing his Rasengan, Jiraiya tries to use his hair needles to take out the animal path, and he shoots in such a wide range that if the animal path tried to dodge, it would surely still be hit. However, rather than dodging, the animal path actually uses a panda summoning to block all of the hair needles, which leads Jiraiya to the conclusion that, oh, all of these individual paths of pain have the ability to share their senses with each other, and thus even though the animal path should have been surprised by the hair senbon attack, because the Preda path could see the attack hurtling its way towards the animal path, the Preda path was able to relay the information of that attack back to the animal path and allow for the animal path to do the optimal thing. Thus, in this moment, Jiraiya realizes that all of their senses are connected, and thus the only way to defeat them is to split them up. and thus Jiraiya retreats, and Ma and Pa tell him about the Toad Confrontation Chant. And thus, as Ma and Pa begin to warm up their vocal cords, the three paths that Jiraiya is battling against begin to work their way back towards him. And Jiraiya immediately crafts a very masterful plan of firing a toad bomb that the Predator path would be preoccupied with absorbing and therefore separated from the animal path and human path. And as the human path had already been previously blinded by Jiraiya's kick to its eyes, Jiraiya was able to push the offensive in a one-on-one battle against the animal path. And the strategy of splitting up the individual paths gave Jiraiya and Ma and Pa enough time to pull off the Toad Confrontation Chant, which captured all three of the paths that Jiraiya was battling against, the human, Predator, and animal paths, under its spell. And the only way out of the demonic Toad Confrontation Chant is either to be released by Ma, Pa, and Jiraiya, or killed, as when a gigantic white veiny sword is driven into your chest, you are simultaneously released from the Toad Confrontation Chant and killed. And thus, even without information heading into this battle, Jiraiya objectively did everything perfect. But it's this point that Jiraiya's lack of information begins to work against him. See, because when Jiraiya drives the final sword through the chest of the animal path, he thinks to himself, well, I've done it. Pain is dead, Nagato is gone, good job me. And at this point, he not only lets his guard down, but also releases his Toad Sage mode. However, unfortunately for Jiraiya, this is exactly when the Asura path shows up behind him and rips his left arm off. Now, obviously, if Jiraiya had access to the information that there are 6 paths of pain and that they are all lurking in the Hidden Rain Village, simply after killing 3 of them, he wouldn't have let his guard down. On top of that, he would have disposed of their bodies, as he would have an innate understanding that the human path, which he hadn't killed yet, had the ability to throw all of these bodies back into the King of Hell's mouth and heal them entirely. And thus Jiraiya not only would have stabbed each and every single one of these paths a whole lot faster, but he also would have sealed their bodies away inside of his barrier, which the human path didn't have access to. And thus Jiraiya, with information, is actually just 3 pains down. And as he would most likely still have his barrier jutsu and his Sage mode activated, the Asura path wouldn't have been able to get the drop on him, and thus Jiraiya simply would have just entered into the second stage of this fight, which would be a battle against the Naraka, human, and Deva paths, as Nagato probably wouldn't have had the time or resources to create 3 new paths. However, even though Jiraiya drops his Sage mode and loses his left arm, and all 6 of the paths of pain pull up on him simultaneously, he is able to swim under the water that they're all standing on and snag the feet of the animal path, once again pulling him under the water and eventually into his barrier. And as Jiraiya pulls the animal path into a boiling belly of toad stomach acid, the animal path is able to fire a chakra rod through Jiraiya's right arm and his right shoulder. However, as the animal path lays there dying in front of him, it actually might be the human path, I don't remember, Jiraiya realizes that whatever path it was actually the corpse of a shinobi that he had fought previously. And thus Jiraiya thinks to himself, incredibly foolishly mind you, that he needs to confirm that all 6 paths of pain are shinobi that he fought previously. Now, mind you, at this point in time, he's sitting safely in his barrier, grievously injured. He could very easily, from this position, summon himself back to Konoha, Mount Muabuko, a myriad of places. And if he understood that one-armed, grievously injured, non-Sage mode Jiraiya was going up against 5 paths of pain simultaneously, and the kind of odds that presented, he probably would have retreated from the battle at this moment in time. On top of that, if he already knew everything that there was to know about Nagato and the 6 paths of pain, he wouldn't need to go back into the fight to confirm these details. So even if hypothetically we weren't to change anything from the main timeline to this new altered Jiraiya knows everything timeline, Jiraiya would simply retreat at this point and survive to see another day. But Jiraiya doesn't know any of this information, so he leaves the barrier and goes to fight against the Deva path and 4 other paths of pain with 1 arm, and thus is summarily killed. But he's able to get crucial information back to Naruto about Nagato and the 6 paths of pain that allows for him to win down the line. So with all of this now considered and meticulously covered, if Jiraiya had access to all of the information he needed about the 6 paths of pain heading into this fight, would he have won? Well, the Deva path seems to believe so, as immediately after Jiraiya's death, the Deva path, aka Nagato, says if we didn't have this secret, we could not have won. And while that's a pretty ringing endorsement for Jiraiya's ability to kill all 6 paths of pain simultaneously, I don't think that's true. Literally, everything up until the moment that Jiraiya drops his guard because he believes he's already killed Nagato, Jiraiya does objectively perfectly. But if we assume that Jiraiya was to use imperfect Sage mode and bolt his arms in a battle against the second iteration of 3 paths, those being the Naraka, the Asura, and the Deva path, Jiraiya would have to simultaneously defeat all 3 of those paths without the usage of the Toad Confrontation Chant. And while Genjutsu was really only a necessity in the battle against the Predator path because of its ability to absorb ninjutsu, Toad Confrontation Chant is by far and away the strongest ability in Jiraiya's bag. But Ma and Pa cannot perform it twice in one day. And while the Naraka path is a relative non-factor in terms of combat ability, as it simply has access to the King of Hell, which allows for it to either operate as a lie detector or as a hospital for paths of pain, the Asura path and the Deva path are walking weapons. See, ignoring for a second that the Deva path could just simply use something like chaotic Shibaku Tensai, which Jiraiya would have absolutely no answer to whatsoever outside of possibly fleeing into his own dimension/barrier, or the fact that the Deva path has access to things like Chibaku Tensai, which Jiraiya would have no means of breaking out of, as only an 8-tailed version of Kurama, which is basically a full manifestation of Kurama, was strong enough to break out of it. But the Asura path, which is also in the equation here, showed an AP high enough to be able to grievously injure Jiraiya. Listen, an exhausted, and yes, I mean exhausted Deva path barely lost to Naruto, who, mind you, is a perfect Toad Sage, the Jinchuriki of Kurama, and had information on him prior. The Deva path alone toyed with people who were relatively close to Jiraiya in power, like Kakashi. And even if you wanted to take the Naraka and Asura paths out of the equation here, I really don't think Jiraiya has the chops to defeat the Deva path in a one-on-one fight. The Deva path was able to counteract the power of a 4-tailed version 2 Cloak Naruto for like 30 minutes. He was able to one-shot all 3 of Naruto's massive Toad summonings simultaneously. And while Jiraiya might have been a more experienced Toad Sage, objectively he's a worse Toad Sage than Naruto. So do I think Jiraiya wins with information? No, unless that information is how to seal Kurama inside of himself. Now, Jiraiya with information does get a lot further than he got without information, as he probably would have been able to kill and dispose of 5 out of the 6 paths of pain, but he just doesn't have an answer for the Deva path. Even if he captured the Deva path in something like his Toad stomach, Itachi showed us that Amaterasu was enough to punch through it, and trust me when I say Chibaku Tensai or Shira Tensai is stronger than Amaterasu. Now, with information, Jiraiya doesn't necessarily have to die, but he's also not winning. But who knows? Maybe I'm wrong. What do you guys think? If you think Jiraiya had all the possible information there was about the 6 paths of pain and Nagato, do you think he could win in that fight? Let me know in the comments below, and while you guys are down there, please, for me, like the video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell.
Oh, but Nick, Nagato said they would have lost.
Then yeah, Itachi said that both him and Kisame would have lost to Jiraiya simultaneously, but there's never really been anything to back up either of those claims.